Hello, hello, hello. Another absolutely amazing and exciting opportunity today to speak with one of my beloved colleagues and friends in the work, and just super grateful to have an opportunity to have a conversation with Thomas Sexton, who is absolutely one of the thought leaders at LinkedIn and beyond in the work of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And I've had the great fortune to work with Thomas for several years at LinkedIn and have always been inspired by his combination of humility and courage. And if you know anything about me, I'm always talking about the importance of being brave, humble, and dedicated. And I honestly have found, Thomas to be a really great example of all three. Of course, he would never say that about himself because that's what the humble part is all about. But I have asked him to come and talk about a little bit of his experiences in the professional realm and personally in practicing allyship and solidarity, and really thinking about what it looks like on both the interpersonal and systemic level. Thank you so much for being here, Thomas.
Thank you, and appreciate those kind words. And I have to say, Dereca, it's really wonderful to be here with you as well, and a real privilege. We partnered together in a professional sense for many years, and you've also personally been a real mentor to me in my own journey. So very, very nice to be sitting across the virtual table from you.
Yes, absolutely. So, Thomas, just to give a little bit of a backdrop for who you are and what you do, can you talk a little bit about how allyship is centered in the work that you do at LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. So my work at LinkedIn is in what we call diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And that work is essentially how do we create a company that a workforce within LinkedIn that is diverse, inclusive, and where people have a sense of belonging. And that work is especially, I believe that work should be important for every organization. It's especially important to us at LinkedIn because our business is about creating economic opportunity for people. It's about people finding jobs. It's about people connecting with other people in the workforce. It's about people connecting to professional opportunity. And if we believe, and I believe deeply, if we don't create an organization where people, one, reflect the communities that we're working with, and two, understand what barriers are out there in the world to creating economic opportunity for people, we are not going to succeed in our vision and our mission. So it's super important to our company. And the way that we think about it, I mentioned diversity, inclusion, and belonging. The diversity piece is who's in the room. And it's thinking about how do we build an organization that is more representative of the world around us. And so being a tech company, we have a number of areas where we are not as diverse as we would like to be. The inclusion piece is about the extent to which people have a voice in the organization. And so you can have a very diverse organization, but if people are not included in decision-making, if they're not represented in leadership, then one, you're not creating a great experience for those employees. And two, you are not creating or unlocking the value of diversity for your organization because it's not influencing how decisions are made or how resources are allocated. And then finally, belonging, we refer to belonging as people being able to show up to work as their authentic selves. And again, if you have an environment, even if people are included in decision-making, even if you have a diverse workforce and people are not able to show up as their authentic selves, if they feel like they need to conform to the way the majority group behaves, then one, they are also not going to have a great professional experience. And you also are not going to, as I said before, unlock the value of those diverse perspectives that are in the room. And so allyship, I think, really fits in the belonging piece in particular, but also in the inclusion piece. And so part of our strategy around diversity, inclusion, and belonging is what we call the environment of belonging. And that's about what type of culture are we creating within the organization. And so part of that is how do people managers show up? What type of environments do people managers create on their teams? A big part of that strategy is allyship. And Dereca, you and your partner have worked with us quite a bit on our allyship curriculum. The reason that we think that is so important is my boss, Rosanna Durruti, has a great observation that belonging isn't something that you can create on your own for yourself. Mm-hmm. It's something that the people around you play a huge role in whether or not you're able to experience belonging. And so we need every single employee at LinkedIn to know how to create an environment where people around them, and in particular, people who are different from them,
Hmm.
experience that belonging, because it's much easier to create belonging typically for people that you have more in common with. So that's how allyship sort of fits into our broader strategy and approach.
Hmm. Absolutely. Wow. I mean, it's absolutely one of the things that I love about LinkedIn is that you all have been so thoughtful in all the different realms of how the work needs to happen. And for some people, they kind of just stop at the like, look, we're diverse. We have lots of people around. But the nuances, the layers of really looking at the equity of different, leadership and voice opportunities for people, and then the thoroughness of understanding that that responsibility is everyone's, and the
Mm-hmm.
investment. I mean, I kind of want you to talk a little bit about the breadth of the work, because that was one of the like absolute yeses for me about working with LinkedIn, is like the resources that you put into it. Because I think sometimes people think, especially in the corporate world, that you can kind of like throw a couple trainings at it. And I think a lot of the success that I've seen, one is, like you said, that it's embedded in the values of the very organization. When you think about
Yeah.
economic opportunity and that kind of equity, that's really powerful. But can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the allyship work, but like
Mm-hmm.
you have a whole team of people and so many different arms to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are lucky in the sense that there is a lot of investment, there's a lot of focus within the organization around this work, and that's because our leadership sees it as a business imperative to get this right. It's not that people, I mean, people also believe that it is important in its own right, but in my experience, organizations that are able to connect the work of D&I to their reason for being as a company, and for
Mhm.
some companies for many companies that has to do with making money, but for other companies it has to do with what's the mission or the vision of the organization.
Right.
But I think that connection allows us to treat this like any other mission critical business priority, which means it gets resourced, which means it gets measured, which means there's a lot of executive scrutiny on it, which means my job is extremely rewarding, but also quite stressful in a good way, because there's a lot of there's a high expectation that we've placed on ourselves. Now, that does not mean that we've accomplished all of our goals yet by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a lot of expectation and resourcing. So a few of the kind of strategies that we have in place, we have a number of different hiring strategies. So we were talking more about inclusion and belonging a minute ago. It's also imperative that we further diversify our organization top to bottom.
Mhm.
And so we've put in place a number of hiring strategies this year that have really, really paid off for us, where we're starting to see a material shift in bringing people into the organization from groups that are underrepresented today. And so, for example, we have these are not our only focus areas, but we have a focus on bringing more Black and Latino employees, in particular leaders, into our workforce, particularly in the US and Europe. We've had a lot of success with that this year.
Awesome.
We have a focus on bringing more women in leadership roles into the organization. And that's an area we've actually had a lot of historical success of moving from a
Yeah.
place of relative weakness, to be totally honest, in our leadership team being predominantly male,
Mhm.
to a world now where we're approaching 50-50. And we also focus on women in technical roles as well, because in Silicon Valley, or in tech in general, we see a high underrepresentation
Mhm.
roles. And those are really critical. One, they're really critical roles for a tech organization, people that are building your product. And two, they're wealth creating roles. And so it's really important that you don't,
Yeah.
wealth creating roles, they tend to be, in the field of technical roles tend to be highly compensated. And so you don't want to have a disparity in a really important part of your organization.
Yeah.
So we
I
have
mean,
hiring initiatives. Oh
the
yeah, I'm sorry.
thing
Yeah, go
about
ahead.
that,
I'm
yeah,
going
no,
on.
no, no, no. I just want to jump in for a second and say the thing about that I always hear though is they're not there. It's a pipeline problem. Like, how have you circumvented that factor? If it's, what do you see
Yeah.
on that?
So part of it is, I think, pushing back
Mhm.
on that line of thinking. But part of it is also understanding where people are coming from when they say that. And so I think there is a reframing that can take place, because what we don't say is just keep doing what you're doing and magically things are going to happen differently,
Right.
right?
Right.
So there is a pipeline problem in the sense that the pipeline that you're tapping into currently is not sufficiently diverse. And so you need to rethink what your pipeline looks like. And
Mhm.
that means rethinking where you're looking for talent. The talent is definitely out there. We're learning that in a really powerful way this year, which I think is also helping us reframe how we think about future years.
Yes.
But whatever you were doing before, you probably weren't finding that talent, if in fact your organization was not as diverse as you would like it to be. So expanding where you're looking, and then also thinking about what is the process by which people come through your funnel. How are you outreaching to them? Are you actually connecting with people in a way that makes them feel comfortable being themselves within your organization? Yeah. What does your interview process look like? What do you consider to be a must-have background versus a background that maybe actually isn't as relevant to whether or not the person can do the job? So it's reframing. It's not just saying, oh, be quiet, the pipeline problem is a myth, like, in a sort of scolding way. It's thinking about, like, what about the pipeline is the problem? It's not the talent isn't out there. It's maybe the way you're approaching it isn't working.
Awesome. Awesome. So I cut you off. I don't want to do that. I just was so excited. Every time you say something, I'm like, oh, I want to ask a follow-up question about that. And so please, you were talking just the hiring, that thing, but there's so much.
Yeah. So we have a strategy around hiring, and then we have a strategy around what we call growth and development. And that's focused on how do we retain and grow the careers of people from groups that are underrepresented at LinkedIn today. We used to actually talk about those two strategies together as, quote, hire and grow. Because it's so important. And I think organizations often go straight to hiring when they think about diversity, of like, okay, we got to bring more people into the org. That's important. But if you're bringing people into an environment where they aren't going to be successful, then, or where they aren't going to experience belonging, then you're not achieving your goals, and you're not creating a good experience for those folks. So
it's a revolving door at that point, right?
The revolving door, exactly, or the leaky bucket, or whatever your analogy is. It doesn't get results in the long term. And so I say growth and development and retention together, because what we find, and this is not rocket science, is one of the main reasons people leave an organization is they don't feel like they have the career development and growth path that they would like, and they think they can get that elsewhere more easily. And so we think of career development and growth as very linked to retention. So we have a whole series of programs around how do we ensure that growth and development of our employees happens equitably, meaning if I am the only Black person on my team, I have the same opportunities, and I believe I have the same opportunities to grow as I would if I'm from the same background as my entire team, or my manager, or my manager's manager. And there are dynamics at play in the workforce that are different for people from groups that are underrepresented. They're not like completely different issues. All people, or many people on the job, want to advance in their careers. Many people face challenges about advancement, but we think about what are some of those challenges that show up differently for people from underrepresented groups, and then how can we address those to support that equitable growth and development. So we have a whole range of kind of programs and processes and focus areas, all focused on that growth and development piece. And then we talked a bit about environment of belonging. I mentioned allyship. The other big pillar there that I know you're familiar with is our inclusive leadership work, and how do we bring that layer of thousands of people managers up the learning journey, and how to become inclusive leaders. And that's hard work, because there are a lot of them. And when you have a lot of people, you're going to have some people that are really good at this, some people that are not good at this at all. And they all play really, really important roles.
Yeah, I mean, so powerful. I think that, I wanted you to talk about an ecosystem, because, some of the folks who engage in this work are really thinking about the interpersonal piece and not recognizing that the environment that they want to bring people into, that they're going, like sometimes I remember when I was at Stanford, I would have student groups come to me and they would say, how do we get more, people of color in our environmental program? And my first question would always be, do you know any people of color? And there'd be this sort of like, well, there was this guy in my frosh dorm. And it's like, okay, so there's all these programs for people of color on campus, right? There's ethnic theme houses, there's community centers, and they all have programs that are open to the public where they encourage people to come. Have you ever been to any of those programs? And, a couple people would say things like, well, I'm not sure if I would be welcome. I'm not sure if that's if I would feel comfortable. And I would pause them and say, okay, so let me get this straight. Like, and I love to have metaphors. So you want people to be the chocolate and caramel chips in your cookie, but you don't want to be the like white chunk macadamia in the chocolate cookie, right? Like you want people to be okay with being uncomfortable or being the only, but you're not willing to have that experience. And so I so resonate with the pipeline thing, because it's, I work with tech companies and I'm like, have you ever heard of Afro Tech? And they're like, no, what's that? And I'm like, the largest, event for Black folks in tech and there's 10,000 people and it's down the street from you in Oakland. And I'm like, yeah, it's there. You just have to be like looking for it. So totally resonate with that. So much I can and want to talk to you about, but I want to actually come back to something that really struck me early in meeting you and made it so clear to me that you were a person whose story needed to be told. And like I can remember the sort of sharing of power thought process that you had where I was like, no,
Mm-hmm.
Thomas, you need to come and tell your story. And you were like, no, you're good. Let them hear yours. And I was like, nope, because so rarely, it's increasing certainly in our society, but so rarely do we have people talk about their own journey being part of a majority group or, you know, a privileged group around like, no, I wasn't born understanding how to do all of this. And yes, it was difficult and scary. And here's how I came through that process. I've heard some of your stories. Feel free to tell whatever you want, but I think it's really valuable for people to hear, you know, how you grew and your understanding of what it means to be an ally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start with a personal perspective, and we can talk about what that's meant professionally too, if that's
Yeah.
helpful. But
Yeah.
so my journey definitely wasn't one that started from a place of humility, bravery, or dedication. That's for sure. And so I grew up in suburban Baltimore, and the Baltimore area is a region that is highly diverse in aggregate, but also highly segregated. And so I grew up in a predominantly white environment, a predominantly white school, and throughout my upbringing, I got certain signals about race and racism. And one of those was that we learned about race and racism in school through a largely, not exclusively, but largely historical lens.
Mhm.
So we studied it, we read Black literature, but we didn't engage, and this is in school or amongst my friends or in my family, we didn't really engage on the topic as a contemporary issue.
Mhm.
And so, we thought of it, or not that we thought of it, but it was sort of described to me and understood as more of a historical issue. And meanwhile, I'm in a highly homogenous environment. And I say this, I had a somewhat diverse group of friends, but my non-white friends, I didn't learn until much later, did not feel comfortable enough with me to share their experiences with race and racism at the time.
Mhm.
And when I say years later, I mean decades later. And so that left me with a couple of kind of implicit impressions. And I probably wouldn't have said this out loud at the time, but I think what I understood internally was race and racism are not topics that really pertain to me.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
necessarily they
And
don't exist,
yeah, and
but yeah,
people always say that we didn't have that when I was growing up. Or, you know, I remember going to Ireland and people telling me we don't have racism here. And I would talk to people of color, and among each other, I asked the Nigerian cab driver, is there racism in Ireland? You know, the story. And he was like, absolutely, it's here, here, and here. And I always hear people from Europe telling me it doesn't exist there, or people like we all got along and everybody loved each other. And it's like,
yeah,
did you have the trust, right, of people
hmm
where they would have told you, right? And it's not,
yeah,
again, none of this is about like you not being a good person or being a good friend or people not liking you, but people don't have that trust generally. It's not
right,
individually, it's societally, in part because, and this is so relevant right now as we talk about what's taught in schools, in part because their reality is not reflected
hmm
in the classroom or in the media, or it's like, no, this is a thing. Our subtle messages are, don't talk about this because it'll make people uncomfortable, right? So then of
yep,
course for decades we did it, right? Or we did
yep,
in certain conclaves or places where people invited the conversation, or when oppression happened or violence happened, then we would talk. But like it just wasn't the thing that you did in positive relationships or civil society, as it were. So yeah.
yeah. And meanwhile, as a white person, my experience was very comfortable,
Mhm.
and at least in that sense. And I didn't have any compelling reason at the time to confront those issues. But well, at least I didn't think I did. I did, but I just wasn't aware of that compelling reason. And I think that's, like you said, that's human nature. That's natural. It's not like it's an inherent flaw in us as humans, but it's something that we need to be aware of and then fight against, which is sort of where the allyship story comes in. So I left high school, I think, very immature in that regard, and I wouldn't have thought of myself as that way. I've had the benefit of a lot of guidance along my allyship journey, which many people don't have that benefit. So I'm very lucky in that regard, but the most transformational moment for me in my life in general, but especially my allyship journey, was meeting my girlfriend and now wife in college. She's African American, and when we first got to know each other, it was an eye-opening experience for me for a couple of reasons. One is we had a lot in common on the surface. So we both went to Dartmouth, obviously. We met at college. Her parents were professionals. My parents were professionals. She actually went to the same high school that my dad went to, coincidentally.
Right.
But of course, we had a tremendous difference in our life experiences, in that she grew up and was Black, and I grew up and was white. It was an eye-opening experience for me because I didn't understand just how different the experience was for people of color. Mm-hmm. And this sounds preposterous to say out loud right now. This is maybe the humility piece, but it wasn't like I didn't think there were differences, but I didn't understand the day-to-day difference of that experience because I never had to experience it myself. And I think my first instinct, I think I had a lot of bad habits, and I did a lot of things like, she would just describe a microaggression, for example, and I might say something like, "Oh, but something like that happened to me too." Mm-hmm. So, maybe it's not what you think it is. I fairly quickly learned through just having a very generous and patient partner how limited my thinking was, and how I needed to shift from assuming that my reality is likely relevant to the people around me, to assuming that my reality is likely very different, and spending much more time listening and assuming that where the differences take place, that those are real differences and not perceived differences.
So powerful. That is so powerful. I mean, I can't say enough. I remember reading the book White Fragility. I cried like 3 times. And I know there's critique about who should make money and all that stuff, but I know I spent a lot of my time in this work saying to, folks who are white, hey, you need to be talking up, you need to be speaking up and talking to other white folks. So when the book came out, I joked that the subtitle should be Black people, you're not crazy, or people of color, you're not crazy, because that's what made me cry. It was just the recognition that, they talk about this term gaslighting. I believe gaslighting is psychological warfare. It's such a burden to constantly have to prove, or even just be validated that something is real, even in the most egregious cases, right? Some of these, police killings, it's like people are still saying, right, that it's not real, or that slavery wasn't really what it is. And I just have to remember that this is what happens, right? People there's Holocaust deniers, there's conspiracy theorists around every disease that ever was, or whether we went to the moon. And I have to remember that this is a thing that people do, but it's so personal to me and to the survival of the people that I love, because the little things, when the people who actually are really supportive, right, of equity, right, and racial justice don't believe the little things, that adds up to inaction or apathy or skepticism on the big decisions that people need to make with, how they vote, where they spend their money, how they respond to injustice when it happens. So thank you, because that just feels so good to hear about that moment when someone goes, oh, maybe I don't know what it feels like, right? Maybe if I just listen more, I actually might. We talk about this all the time as the learning edge, right? If I get outside of the place where this makes me uncomfortable to talk about difference, then, I'll learn something, right? So awesome. Yeah.
And you mentioned the term gaslighting. One of the things I think is really wonderful about this moment that we're in right now is, maybe I just wasn't aware, but I feel like there's a lot more language that we didn't have, or at least I wasn't aware of. And when I first heard that term, I had this very visceral moment where it's like, oh my goodness, I have definitely been a gaslighter at times, and still am, I'm sure, in some circumstances. But it hit me, but it was also helpful in being able to articulate what that concept is, to be able to think about when I might be doing it and how to try to avoid doing it.
Yeah, I guess I should say what it is. But it's that
Good
construct
point.
where, yeah, someone says, what is true for them, for their experience, what they've been experiencing their whole life in their identity. And then someone who hasn't had that experience, right, denies that that's a reality for them, right? And it's just this constant stream. And even people who have that experience sometimes gaslight, but it's this constant
Mm-hmm.
stream of, you're probably wrong about what you think is happening to you, right? Or how do you know it's that? Or that's not what it was this. It's like that just complete undermining and dismissal of like the possibility that I might actually know as a woman or as a queer person or a person of color, I might actually know what is happening to me. So it's just
Yeah.
powerful to
Yeah.
hear that recognition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I could talk a bit more about
Yeah.
allyship journey, or
Yes, please.
yeah. So that was obviously a deeply personal, incredible accelerant in my
Correct.
allyship journey. And you mentioned that college experience, and where I went to school, also highly segregated environment, and I the sort of world of the Black experience at college was something that I didn't understand very well at all. Until I met Margaret, and it was an incredibly enriching moment when I was going to the AM events, and I was going to the Delta Sigma Theta programming that she and her
Yay,
sorority
that's
sisters
my
were running.
sorority.
Yeah, call that out. And it was one thing that I often say about an allyship journey is it's always talked about in terms of how do you create a better experience for those around you, but it is an incredibly enriching experience for the person on the journey in a completely selfish way as well, not in addition to sort of an altruistic way. I think that is something that I talk to people in a professional environment about a lot, and I think being on this journey of allyship, being on this journey of cultural humility is something that, and this again isn't to say I've mastered that, but kind of pushing myself in this area is something that has made me a much better professional and a much more effective leader, and has made me better at my day job, which makes me more effective, makes me feel better about the work I'm doing. It's like good for me in an objective way, in addition to the sort of, end goal of the allyship work, which is to make experiences for those who are different from you better. So the other piece that I haven't talked about is moving into active allyship. So there's a sort of increasing your understanding, pushing your thinking, pushing your old ways of thinking, which is like a foundational and critical thing to do in one's allyship journey, but it's not really like, doesn't necessarily create outcomes in and of itself. Right. And I had another moment, as many people did, with the killing of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile 5 or 6 years ago, and the kind of rise of the first Black Lives Matter movement, and the murders in South Carolina, I think were maybe a year or so before that. And those were moments for me, again, I'm a bit embarrassed that these came this late, when I started thinking more about like, what is my active voice here? Not just like, how am I talking to my friends, but what am I doing in the workplace in particular? And the murders of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile occurred at an interesting time. It was around the 4th of July, and our company shuts down for the entire week of the 4th of July. So I'm off all next week. And so I was just like reflecting on this. This is all happening while I was on vacation. Really, really intense period for everyone. But I found myself much more engaged than I had been with the news before. And I was reflecting on the fact that we're all going to come back from work, and 90% of people are going to be talking about their barbecues and how great their vacations were, and, oh, where did you go this year? And it's so great. I'm so refreshed. And there's going to be a lot of people at work that are going to really, really be struggling, because they're going to be processing what's going on externally. And there, again, with the language piece, people were starting to write about this already, of like, how are people going to be feeling when they come back to work after this? And so that was a moment where I was like, I should really start talking about this proactively in the office. And now here I am, this is something I'm very uncomfortable with at the time. Now it's my job, so I'm becoming more comfortable with it. But at the time I was working in marketing. I had no expertise in D&I. I had really no, I had nothing other than the fact that I had worked at LinkedIn for a long time, and that granted me influence in the organization. And so I started taking small steps around reaching out to other leaders and saying, hey, we should all be checking in with our people this week, and we should be very careful about how we're talking about our 4th of July break, and we should be giving people space, all the things that now are like very, very common in the discourse. Mm-hmm. But for me, those steps felt very uncomfortable because I was like, first of all, who am I to be saying this? Second of all, am I even saying the right thing? Am I even giving good advice? Am I even saying the right thing to my team? But I was going back to like, I have a responsibility to do this because I am aware of what's going on and I have influence in this organization, some earned and some unearned. So that was another kind of step in like passive to active.
You know, Thomas, this is one of the reasons why I wanted you here is you always manage to say something that, whether it's just our connection or what it is, that like just moves me. Philando Castile was actually one of the moments in the movement for Black Lives, in just my awareness of issues of police brutality, and it impacted me so deeply. I cried and cried and cried, and I was away at a retreat that was 90% white. And it was like this deeply emotional, like, you know, intimate awareness of your feelings kind of space. And I needed that container, right, of all these like super progressive, I kind of call them my ex-hippie folks, right, folks to hold this for me. And at that moment, we were, as you said, so far away from some of the consciousness we have now. People were like, that's not what this space is for. Right now, it's a space where, you know, we're talking about intimacy and deep connection with people. But there were so many people who were like, that's not what I came here for. That's not what this space is for. I'm here for something else. And some of these were people I loved deeply. And I just fell apart. And thankfully, there were a few people there who could hold the space for me. One of them is actually part of the reason why I'm doing this course with the Shift Network. So shout out to Phoenix. But it was one of the most painful moments in my relationship with this community that I've been in relationship with for a decade. And I so grateful that we've evolved into a place for many of us where the community around you is holding that space, right? It's always a hard balance because, especially at work, a lot of folks are like, I don't want 30 people to check in with me where I can't work and I have to hold everyone. I always tell people, you can check in, but don't cry, right? And like have someone feel like they've got to take care of you because you're so sad when their whole community is impacted and their fear is activated around what will happen for people they love. So thank you. It's always amazing to me how these conversations reveal deep connections across our differences by what impacts us. And this moment of courage for you, this is what I think is so important for people to hear. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, and I did it anyway. And what I say to people is, you're brave enough to take that risk and humble enough to get the feedback that you didn't do it right, because that's what paralyzes people. Is they're afraid to get it wrong. They're afraid to be canceled, called out, called racist, told they did it wrong, because no one wants to be a bad person, right? But our silence is complicit, right? And so none of that I'm into, like the guilt of bad people, no matter what you're doing, but I am really aware. And I talk to people a lot about this with other communities, right? How did we get all the rights that we have? How did we get integration of races? How did we get rights for women? How did we get, domestic partnership? All of these things happened because people with power, right, from privileged identities, said yes to the work and activism, yes, activism, the A word, right, of people who were speaking up around these issues. And people said, yes, I will make this mine. Yes, I will make the space. Yes, I will honor, right, the discrimination, oppression, right, and violence that these communities are facing. So it is really powerful to see I think how one person thought about what they could do, not just for themselves, right? Because like you said, you were in marketing, you weren't doing dibs at that point, right? But what they could do in the environment where I think it's also important to note that you talked about your power, right? You had been there for a while. And so many people who, are a part of this course and this work really have that. They've been at their, spiritual center for a while. They've been at their school for a while. They've been there. And it's like, yes, it's a risk, right? Yes, you might get called out, right? But you have capital, right? That actually insulates you a little bit. People are going to go, well, I know Thomas, right? He's a good guy, right? And he's good at his job. I like working for him. I like there's all this goodwill that people have as currency that a lot of people don't have who are from, more marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds. So much I want to talk to you about.
That note,
yeah, go for it.
Could I say one very quick thing?
Yeah,
because I think what you said about capital is really powerful. And one thing I encourage folks that I work with to do is think about, we're always thinking about how do we accrue political capital or like influence, but you also need to think about where you invest your capital. And there's a point to accruing all that capital. If you just let it sit on the shelf, then it doesn't do you any good to the people around you. And so sometimes you want to invest it, and usually when you invest it, it's going to grow. So I think that my influence increased at LinkedIn. I was worried that it might not when I did that, but now, this is a longer story that I won't get into, but by virtue of me kind of saying things and kind of speaking about this topic more frequently and openly, I got connected to the job that I now have. And now I'm in a real dream job. And so it was actually accruing, but sometimes you just want to spend down your capital if you have it. And I think that was just a great way of putting it, Dereca.
Yeah, awesome. And then what we see with so many people, I mean, sometimes people ask me, why are we talking about this? And I was like, because the whole world is talking about this. Like, this is, other than, the environment, this is the issue of our day, right? Xenophobia, the fear of others, the oppression, the tensions, all of this is what we have to be talking about if we want to be good citizens of our day. And you're right. There's so few people with privileged identities who feel like, who consistently take the risk, right? Who have that, what you talked about, active allyship. And there's more and more and more. And what I keep telling people is everybody's so focused on the people who don't get it or on the quote unquote other side. And I'm like, the movement for Black Lives was the biggest movement in history. We have so many people who are interested in allyship. What if we just focused on what we could build with those people? What if we just focused on, one of the people I interviewed in this series talked about just having 3 white friends that like are working on it, like she's working on it, and how valuable it is to her to go back to them as a sounding board, so as not to put the burden on people who are struggling, who are the targets of these issues. And she says, I just take things to them and I go, oh, I got this feedback that I did this wrong. You help me process it, or I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And just having those 3 friends actually is so critical for her in just sustaining this work. So I want to ask you 2 more things, and I'm just going to let you go because I get so excited when you start talking. I want to talk with you.
And we can go on a couple more minutes too if we want.
Okay. All right. Good. I want to know 2 things. One question we get a lot is, as parents, how do you, give this to your children so that it's not something you're trying to correct later? And so I'd love any insights that you have about, I know you have a 7-year-old, and, just thinking about the insights that you have around what's mattered, or I don't want to say worked, because I think that's a misnomer that people think, oh, if I do this, then it like eliminates, racism, it eliminates internalized oppression and all those things. That's not it. But what have you found that's mattered? And then the other thing is, when you get canceled, because I know that happens, or you get, negative feedback or whatever, like what sustains you? What's your dedicated look like? So what have you seen that matters with children? And then how do you sustain all of this?
Yeah. So with children, boy, this is where I'm not an expert. So take this as one person's opinion. Okay. But so I have 7-year-old twins and a 4-year-old.
Oh, that's right.
One of the things we try to do with them at this age is normalize talking about difference. And so we and one thing I wrestle with, especially last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, is how much detail do we share with at the time a 6-year-old? Because we want them to be aware of what's going on, and we want them to be aware of the issues, but we also don't want to freak them out because they're children. And so one of the things that we do is, so we did talk about what the Black Lives Matter movement is. We talk about what racism is. We talk about police brutality in a fairly sanitized and age appropriate way. But we don't like shield them from those issues. But on a more day-to-day basis, we try to normalize talking about just how people are different. So we talk about race a lot. Which is natural because we're a multiracial family. We talk about gender identity. And the other thing I try to do is I'm already like of an older generation, and so they're going to be hipper than me on this stuff. So I try to I try to push myself a bit. So they have a classmate who just came out as non-binary recently. And we had already talked years ago with the twins about, okay, some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are non-binary, and some people use she pronouns, he pronouns, and they pronouns. And we don't always get the language quite right. Like for a while, they were like, so-and-so is a he, so-and-so is a they. And it's like, well, it's actually the pronouns they use, not that they are a he. But we try to have those conversations about difference on a regular basis. So it feels, the idea of somebody having a different experience from them won't feel like scary or strange or unusual. And it's not to say that we're going to anticipate every type of difference they're going to encounter, but if we familiarize kind of conversations about different identities, then whatever comes up in the future, I hope they will kind of naturally approach with curiosity instead of with, a sort of self-oriented view. But like I said, they're 7. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. But it's a beautiful construct just to think about. I think we've been taught for so long, especially older generations, colorblind, right? You don't say anything. It's racist to bring it up, right? That's kind of now it's a resurgent, conversation that if you talk about race, then that's what's racist. And it's like, I can't believe we're back to that.
Don't get me started.
Right? It's just like, oh, how did we get back there? It's such a circular thing. But just the acknowledgement that at any age, it's okay to talk about difference, right? Like this is the thing, going back to your conversation about high school, that we've been suppressing, right? Like when all of this started happening, one of the hardest things to hear when the movement for Black Lives and these police brutality issues came up was, I'm so shocked. It was like, how can you be shocked? Right? How can you be shocked when there's Rodney King, when there's the civil rights movement, when there's slavery? Like, how can you be shocked? Like, this has never happened, right? Like, this has been happening. And until it's never stopped happening. And so, but I always tell people, if you have Mr. Friendly who went and got the cat out of the tree, I get how it wasn't a part of your daily reality, but it was certainly in the media forever. Right? In the newspaper before the television and the radio, whatever. And so it's just always interesting to me the way in which we have been taught to suppress any conversation about identity as being, because we're uncomfortable, especially when we're in the majority. I for sure didn't want to talk about being cisgender. Like, I was like, that doesn't, right? But that's where I have so much humility and compassion for the allyship journey, because I made a billion mistakes and still do sometimes, right? Or disability. Like I was just talking to one of my friends, Terry, who did these recordings with me, and like she's had like 10 things that I was getting wrong. And this is like this is my career. And I was like, what? I couldn't even hide my shock. I was like, oh my gosh, really? That's not a thing, or that is a thing. And then she's just one person. Like you said, you'll see how it turns out with your kids. So I can't go and tell other disability activists or people with disabilities that, well, Terry said it's like this. So it is hard. You're not going to get like a check mark, right? Or a pin or a certificate that says, now you know how to talk about these things. You're going to get a crapshoot and, feedback, and then you keep going, which is the last thing. How do you keep going?
How do you keep going? So a couple things. 2 of them are sort of like more intellectual, and one is more of something that I'm trying to do better from just a more like kind of emotional perspective. So I'm just going to be honest, repeat some things you said earlier, because they're right on. One is just framing the the personal journey of allyship, but also the like work of diversity, inclusion, and belonging as an indefinite endeavor. In
Mhm.
my mind, it doesn't have an endpoint or like a an achievement unlocked and now you're good to go. And I think that just helps. It's like preparing yourself for a marathon. Like if you think of this as something that's going to be indefinite, one, you don't have to always be doing it perfectly all the time. You can
Mhm.
have a bad day, or you can take a week off from doing a good job, or you can forgive yourself for slacking off or whatever that might be, because you know you're going to come back to it, versus assuming, okay, like once the season is over, I'll finally be done with my allyship work and I can move on to my next thing.
Right.
Um, the second is like a feeling of responsibility tied to my privilege, of in various facets of that word, of this is actually something that I need to do. It's not something that I actually can opt out of. And that sustains me to an extent. The third thing is and this is something that I wrestle with, is that those first two things put a lot of pressure on me. And I'm a person who's fairly anxious by nature. And so, thinking like I have a responsibility to do this, I have this privilege and I have to make sure that I'm not squandering it, or worse, that I'm not, using it for, to the detriment of others. That is not a great recipe for giving yourself grace, being kind of constantly focused on that. And so I'm trying to do a better job of basically being compassionate to myself more
Yes.
often,
Yeah.
and like practicing self-care for myself. There's so much great discourse about making sure you're practicing self-care in difficult times. And I have this instinct of like, no, that doesn't really apply to me actually. Like I don't get to practice self-care right now because so many other people are even more deserving of that break or of that indulgence. Not that it would be an indulgence, but I have that thinking.
Yeah.
And so I actually try to be more kind to myself. And that even is like accepting, like the wonderful things you were saying about me at the very beginning of this call. My first instinct is like, ooh, like, I don't know about that. Like, we're in public. Please don't say that about me. But I'm trying to accept those types of things, because you can't sustain yourself in my experience entirely through like hardcore motivation. I think you have to also
Yeah.
give yourself grace along the way.
Absolutely. That's actually one of the goals of this course, is to have people find their personal pathway, right? Because I joke about activism as the A word, but to me, it's either activism or passivism, not pacifism, but
Mm-hmm.
passivism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't, as you said, you can't do nothing, because otherwise the status quo is just happening and you're the conveyor
Yep.
belt, Peggy McIntosh, you're just going along with it. You can't do nothing. That's one of the options that's not available. But you don't have to do everything, and you don't have to do protest, and you don't have to, and you shouldn't berate yourself or get stuck in guilt, because it's actually keeping anything from happening, right? That's where all
Mm-hmm.
the clog is, right? It's not just with, people who don't believe in this. It's also with people who believe in this and don't feel like they know what to do, or they have the courage to do the things that they see that should be done. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is so wonderful, because I think hearing someone and their journey and their struggle and the moments that matter is probably so much more digestible, right? Palatable, reachable. Like everything you said today, I feel like can be one step that someone takes. And especially this piece around compassion for yourself, right? I try so much to talk about the mistakes that I've made, because I think when people can see someone like myself who has marginalized identities, talk about my privilege and my struggle and my journey and my dedication to keep going with that, I think that is actually what inspires. So thank you so, so much, Thomas. It's always great to talk to you. And I feel completely selfish to have had this much time with you. And thank you on behalf of everyone who will see this.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a real privilege chatting with you. And I learn something every single time I talk to you. So believe me, the feeling is very, very mutual.